Great. So without further ado, I'll start sort of giving background or prompting our panelists for background on the discussion that we'll be having today, primarily about USA Swimming's governance restructure, but how it can inform inclusion and governance at other sports organizations. So to start off, Van, could you give us a little bit of an overview of the state of USA Swimming's governance and board of directors before this governance restructure took place? Where did this all start?
Yeah, so our board, when I came on was, and Michael, you might have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but comprised of 30 plus members when I started in 2000. What, 25?
35.
35, okay. Yeah, 35 total members when I started in 2014. Of which I would say about 7 were ex officio members, past presidents of the organization, and we had 5 total athletes. USA Swimming's board was big and not the most nimble body in the world. We had a president, 4 vice presidents, and then a treasurer as the named officers. And then one of the vice presidents was the vice president of athletes. They also chaired USA Swimming's athlete executive committee. And that would be USA Swimming's athlete council, if you will. The USA Swimming governance structure consists of the board of directors, then the House of Delegates, which is made up of representation from across our entire membership based on the 59 local swimming committees that are affiliated to USA Swimming and are basically registration and programming arm of the sport. So it's kind of the governance restructure. And yeah, if Michael wants to fill anything in there, feel free. But that.
Yeah, the 59 smaller groups that Van mentioned basically align with.
Like before we restructure.
Van, I think you might be breaking up a little bit, but Michael might be able to fill in the parts that you were trying to get at.
Yeah, the one point I was going to make was the 59 sub-organizations basically line up with state borders. So Van's currently in Wisconsin swimming. I'm just recently retired from Minnesota swimming. Some of the larger states are split up into multiples, and some of the smaller states are combined into one, but they're largely geographic. That's where most people's points of contact with swimming are their particular, it's called LSC, which is short for local swim committee in the swimming world. Your local meets are sanctioned by the LSC. Your teams are members of the LSC. That's where all the decisions are made about meet schedules and who can swim in what meets and that sort of thing. So that's the main point of contact for most swimmers and their families is the one of the 59 LSCs.
Great. And one thing that Van mentioned was sort of the unwieldy nature of the size of USA Swimming's board of directors at the time that this restructure was commissioned. Michael, do you want to touch a bit on how that affected USA Swimming's board of directors' role as a governance board as opposed to a management board, what the difference is between the two, and what some of these young athletes might take from that difference?
Sure. I mean, it's fairly standard that an organization in its early stages, your board of directors, your board people, your board leadership are going to be the people that are doing the kind of the day-to-day work. They're going to be the ones that are making the decisions. They're going to be doing, really getting their hands dirty in managing the organization. But as organizations grow, they become more successful. They get more members. They hire staff. The board should be moving away from the day-to-day stuff and more looking at strategic things, more looking at down the road and less looking at today or tomorrow. And we refer to that as the difference between management and governance. So the board needs to kind of get its hands off the day-to-day. And in case of USA Swimming, it had a staff of 80 some people, professional people that are getting full-time salaries to work in an office in Colorado Springs. They should be doing the day-to-day stuff. They're the ones that should be handling all of the, get your hands dirty kind of stuff. And the board by that point should have moved away towards more strategic planning down the road, those sorts of things, and not looking over the shoulder of the staff members in Colorado Springs. And that's fairly standard for most organizations as they go through their growth cycle. At some point, the board needs to make that jump, and some make it sooner than others. And USA Swimming probably should have done it sooner. They didn't. They did it in 2017. So that was kind of the impetus for it. So that's kind of what we're here to talk about.
Great. And Van, could you walk us through some of the findings of the study that originally started with the athlete council's sort of prompting? What was the most surprising thing to you and to other athlete board members at the time?
Yeah, and so I want to highlight one thing for the group here is that it was the five athlete board members that really drove the internal USA Swimming push to make the effort to restructure based on exactly what Michael was just talking about. When in 2017, USA Swimming had 95 full-time staff members. And we felt that the 8-hour board meetings and the conversations that we were having in those board meetings they weren't really pushing, I guess, for what the future of the sport looked like, and was far too focused on the day-to-day. And I think that the athlete perspective was, why are we so focused on management when we have this staff and we spend all of this money on staff? So I just want to underscore that it was younger athletes that helped the non-athletes in the room really understand why we felt that moving as an organization to more of a governing board was critical. So what I will say was probably the most startling finding in my mind was how many people were more open to it than we thought. So it started out, the first step was they did, the governance consultant that we brought in did constituent surveys with basically all of the board members. And what came out of that was, one of the surprising things was how open people were to the idea of the change, but I don't think that they truly grasped like the concept that and the distinguishing aspects of managing a managing board versus a governing board, like Michael just described. And so that was a bit surprising to us. I guess the other thing that was sort of surprising, but maybe not, was just how much more efficient the board would be if it were smaller. And I guess to me that was intuitive, and I think to my fellow athlete colleagues that was an intuitive notion. But I think for a third party to explain that to people was kind of startling for a lot of folks. So yeah, those were, I would say, the two things that were really kind of the key takeaways and important.
Great. And we just got a question in the chat. So what is the structure now for USA Swimming and US Soccer that incorporates young athletes? Just as a clarification point here, the focus of young athletes that we have at the boarding school is a little bit different from the regulations that require USOPC organizations to have amateur athletes on their board. We at the boarding school are a little bit more focused on athletes on the younger side because these organizations tend to serve younger people. And as an organization that's dedicated to empowering young people to serve on the boards of the organizations and the institutions that they're a part of, we have a partiality to younger athletes than athletes that might be a little bit older as part of these organizations. But Michael or Van, do you want to give a little bit more context to the structure of how USA Swimming incorporates athletes, amateur athletes on the whole? And then maybe Brianna, if you want to hop in with how US Soccer does it, that would be helpful.
Sure. Let me quickly go through what we did with the board. So we went from 35 seats, which included a bunch of representative members. So the U.S. Masters Swimming had a seat on our board. The NCAA had a representative on the board. The YMCA Swimming had a seat on the board. The American Swim Coaches Association had a seat on the board. There were one or two others. We got rid of all of them. They're a phone call away. You don't need to be on the board. We had some geographic designations. Those 59 LSCs I told you about are in 4 different geographic zones. Each of those zones had 2 seats on the board. We got rid of that. And we basically cut the board down to 15 seats, and 3 of them are elected by the athletes. So it's 3 athletes at least, and there's nothing that says an athlete can't also get one of those other seats as well. And we have had other athletes run for those seats unsuccessfully, but they can run for an at-large seat. And Van can talk more specifically about what athletes get chosen, but I don't think anybody would be surprised by it. And we did away with a bunch of the specific, like Van said, the vice chairs of this, vice chair of that, vice chair of the other thing, because what ended up happening was there were term limits on each of those positions. So somebody would serve the limited of the 2 terms in vice chair of finance, and then the next election they'd hop over and run for vice chair of administration, and then they'd hop over to the vice chair of programming, and then the vice chair of development. So it was just basically swapping seats, and you ended up with the same 5 or 6 largely old white men on the board. And we did away with that. There's lifetime term limits. You can't just change your chair and sit there for the next 4 or 8 years. It's actual lifetime term limits. You got to step away from the board once you've reached the max. So I think that will, I think we've already seen in the few years that's made a huge difference in terms of the people who are getting elected and who's guiding the organization at this point. So, but if Van wants to talk more about the athletes, he's probably better positioned to do that than me.
Yeah, so presently our 3 athlete board members of USA Swimming are USOPC qualified athletes. So the criteria to under the USOPC bylaws is either within the last 10 years having competed in Operation Gold meet or competition, or within 24 months of election having finished in the top half of the national championship of your respective sport. So so those athletes tend to skew a little bit older, but USA Swimming has an athletes executive committee that's completely comprised of younger, probably in the early college to just graduated college years. And that's a body of 10 members. And one of our board athletes sits on that committee to solicit and engage the the younger perspective and bring that perspective to the board level. So that's how it's been structured now, that our board is smaller, so there's less athletes than before, and now that all those athletes are USOPC qualified. So did I get that pretty well, Michael? In terms of
yeah.
And then I would just also say that our each of our local swimming committees boards is required to have 20% athlete representation on them too. So that then brings our total athlete committee in USA Swimming to a little over 120 people. So the athletes executive committee serves the athletes committee and solicits information and communicates with all of those 120 local swimming committee athletes on a periodic basis throughout the year.
And in addition to that, there are various working committees, volunteer working committees within USA Swimming, and each of them has some degree of athlete representation on it as well. For example, there's a LSC development committee, which addresses issues of LSCs. And my daughter Kelly was on that for a number of years. And then there's an age group development committee, which focuses on the 12 and under swimming, development swimming. And my son spent a few years on that committee. I was on the national governance committee, as Julia mentioned, for a number of years. And we had a couple of different athletes that served as well on that committee. And there's a whole slew of other committees in the structure of USA Swimming that each has its own little piece and advises on the issues within their remit. Like there's an open water committee, there's all sorts of committees. So athletes have an opportunity to get involved in one of those committees in an area that, is specific to what their interests are.
Great. And just to add sort of another level of context, Brianna, do you want to quickly summarize what athlete representation looks like within US Soccer?
Yeah, so you guys spoke a lot about the board and the barring point of entry for the US Soccer board is that you have to have represented the senior national team. So that keeps young athletes from being a part of it. Currently there's 15 members on the board. So there's 2 non-voting members, 3 kind of athletes from the council, 2 youth council seats, 2 adult seats, 2 pro seats, and 3 independent voters, and then 1 at-large council seat. So for me and the other 4 members on the athlete council that are part of Next Gen United, we would have to represent the senior team to be in contention to be a part of the board. And maybe that's a step in the next direction, but we'd like to kind of change those rules so that we could get different perspectives, because since we are moving to 33%, they will add 3 more seats, I think, right? Yeah. So it'll be 18. And within the board, of the 33% athlete power, Next Gen United will have just over 8% of voting influence that will kind of project on the sitting members on the board. So yeah, that's a little bit about ours. It's a little bit complicated, but we definitely like to see more representation on the board, because a lot of the demographics are pretty much the same.
Great. And I mean, one thing that I have observed just in learning about the way that all of these organizations' governance structures look like is that although they're oftentimes governed by the same federal regulations, each organization sets it up, the way that they want to. So this is a great opportunity to learn from each other. Sort of going back to what we were talking about with this reforms process and how it may have had an impact on young people and particularly young athletes' involvement with USA Swimming's governance structure. Van, could you talk a little bit about what this process of reforming the board and the reforms themselves did well and maybe did not so well as far as their involvement of young people in USA Swimming's governance along the way?
Yeah. So admittedly, USA Swimming was not in compliance with USOPC athlete eligibility criteria on its board of directors. And so that was something that got cleaned up as a result of the governance change. But I think I think that cuts both ways, and kind of dovetailing off of what Brianna said, you know, it, as a result of being more USOPC compliant with our athlete representation at the board level, I think it, in some ways, cut out some of the, certainly the vote that our grassroots level athletes could have at the board level, because before the governance change, like I was a okay swimmer, but I by no means did I compete at an Olympic Games or World Championships or Pan Pacs.
Division
or
One college, NCAA
yeah,
Division One.
yeah. So, you know, I was able to serve on the board, but I was the last of that level of swimmer to be able to serve on the board. And now you have to, you know, as I described, be Opsgoed or have finished in the top half of nationals in the last 24 months prior to election. So anyways, you know, that being said, I think it cut a little bit of that true vote for grassroots or younger athletes out of our board. But on the other hand, I think it opened up a new dialogue, the way that the structure was formed between our national team level athletes and our grassroots level athletes that didn't really exist anymore before. Because when we restructured the board, we also restructured our athletes executive committee. And one of the things we did was we put the board member, a board athlete, onto that committee. And that had not been the case in the past. And that way, that board athlete now gets to garner the you know, the ground or grassroots level perspective. And, you know, theoretically, that is being projected in how they're making decisions at the top level. So I don't want to be too cynical that like it was a regressive step. I think it was a necessary step. And I think moving forward, like Brianna said, you know, USA Swimming is going to be going forward with the 33%. I think it's going to be interesting to see how these NGBs within the USOPC structure work to engage more of that grassroots level perspective, and younger athletes is what I mean by grassroots level athlete perspective, as they increase the representation in the governing boards.
Great. And Michael, feel free to add anything to that. I was curious to know from your perspective, based on what Van just said, what other gaps in USA Swimming's efforts to include an increasingly diverse and young athlete population you might have noticed. I also think this might relate to Thomas's question in the chat about wanting to know how we can have these more junior athletes be represented, given different sport organizations' governance structures.
I'm actually a little more cynical about this than Van. I think it was a necessary step to thin the eligibility, or to tighten the eligibility of the board. And I'm not as close to it as he certainly was, but it seems to me like that detachment of athlete board members who are athletes, the detachment from the athletes as a whole, so the separation between elite athletes and everybody else who, by the way, is the majority of the organization, is a problem. I think it's a significant problem. I mean, we've got, you know, maybe, I don't know, 100 athletes who are maybe eligible for those seats. And the reality of it is the ones who get elected are the ones that have gold medals. So yeah, maybe the field includes people who are in the top half, but that's not who's getting voted for. It's people who've won gold medals, which is fine. But they're not representing the 10 and under kid who's just learning how to go to swim meets. And they shouldn't, but there should be some voice on the board somebody who's representing that, because that's who's paying the membership fees for the organization, and there's thousands of them, and that is the base of the organization. That is the majority of the organization, is people who are never going to the Olympics. So the fact that Olympians have 20% of the board seats, I think they're a little overrepresented in the organization.
Do you think that there are other sports organization practices that you've seen that do this well? And this can be a question that either Van or Michael, feel free to jump in.
I think, I mean, obviously many of the sports are different. Soccer is particularly different than swimming, because swimming, it's all about the Olympics. I mean, everything that USA Swimming does is directed at the Olympic medal podium, the podium for the Olympics. And soccer, there's other ways to be successful at soccer other than winning the soccer Olympic medal. In fact, that's not even the pinnacle in men's soccer. So everybody does a little bit differently. And I'm not sure that yet I've seen an example of an organization that does account for those vast majority of its membership. Hopefully, as they go from a fifth to a third, there's more opportunity to include those voices somehow. But I can't point to some organization that I'm aware of that is doing it the right, in an effective way yet. I hope to be proven wrong.
I think it's really interesting how Michael kind of framed it. I think the hard part for swimming was we couldn't not be compliant with the USOPC
Sure.
requirements anymore, and that's what's hard. Is I think there's this tension because swimming was doing it. I think we were doing a pretty good job of getting that younger voice and that grassroots level perspective at the board level. And so, it kind of harkens back to, and I think there's probably some people on the call who have been and participated in, the USOPC's AAC conversations about reforming the Sports Act and reforming the USOPC bylaws. I wasn't privy to a lot of those conversations, heard about some of it through the grapevine, but, I think it's going to, in order for it to change at the NGV level, it's going to require changes at the USOPC level. And then just to answer Julia's question about organizations that do it well, I would say in swimming, I think our local swimming committees do it pretty well. And they do it well because they're the closest to it. And the athletes that are on those boards are ages 14 to 18, and there's no performance criteria for them to be members of the board. So I think our LSCs, and Michael, maybe respond to this, but I think our LSCs do it pretty well.
And I think that's probably right, and maybe that's more important because, like I said, when I talked about the LSCs at first, that's most people's touch point with swimming is the LSC. So it's probably more important there. But I also think, it'd be nice if it got more than just sort of a little nod at the top level as well.
And I see that Nathan has a question, so I'll spotlight him. Feel free to jump in, Nathan.
Awesome. Thank you. Michael and Van, thank you for joining. This is a really great conversation. And I'm also super excited that we have so many different sports represented here. Because there are perspectives that I hadn't even thought about. I come from the soccer world. I wish I had participated as an athlete at the highest level, but I actually worked at the U.S. Soccer Federation very closely with the president and the board, and so I'm coming more from the governance side of things. And just Michael and Ben, hearing you both talk about, obviously there are some things that you think U.S. Swimming is doing well, some things that maybe not so much. I also know U.S. Soccer reformed its board significantly about 20 years ago, and now they're going to have to do it again, and they have some buyer's remorse with how they did it last time. So just generally speaking, I don't think anyone's ever going to get it 100% right, but what are some of the like guiding principles of good governance that were part of the discussion when restructuring the U.S. Swimming Board? Like, what were you striving towards, and what were we trying to avoid? And obviously, there can be differences of opinion on how to maximize it, but like, what were the central guiding stars?
Sure. But before I talk about that, I'm going to say nobody's going to get it right, and even if you do, you're going to have to change anyway. I mean, it's a process. It's not a place. You have to constantly reevaluate, reassess, and readjust. So with that as the starting point, and the key things you're looking for in any organization that is governed properly and governed well is accountability, transparency, self-assessment, and responsibility. So the members have to be comfortable that the board is making decisions in a transparent fashion, that there's no what's going on back there kind of stuff. And we know who's making the decisions, and if decisions don't result in what we expect them to, that we take ownership of it and we fix it. I mean, it's a constant process. It's never done, because the world around you is changing, and you have to constantly be self-assessing the whole organization and the various parts of it. For years, no board ever did a self-assessment. I mean, it's supposed to be an annual thing now. That's kind of the, what did we do this year? What were our goals? How did we achieve them? That sort of thing. And that has to be part of every board's annual process. And individual board members should be doing that themselves, about their contributions to the board. It's like, okay, this term on the board, these are my goals. These are the things I want to get done. And then be honest about it. It's like, am I making progress? Am I, so it's an individual thing as well. But the key things are accountability, transparency, self-assessment, and responsibility. Dan, do you have anything else?
I would just add that, from the athlete's perspective, when we visioned all of this moving forward, our hope was that our board would get out of the way of our staff and let them do their job. and then in turn, we could have discussions about what the future of our sport looked like, and what we were going to do to grow swimming in the US, and the staff could be left to do the day-to-day. And so truly, we just wanted our board to be a strategic board and a governing board versus a management in the weeds on the day-to-day basis. So that was our big principle. And I think that was something that drove a lot of the work that the governance consultant did, and that ultimately was reflected in the legislative package that changed everything.
Great. Any follow-up, Nathan? All good? Great. Well, thank you both, Michael and Van. I also see Carolyn had a question in the chat that she is in. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Carolyn. I'm interested to hear if and how you think the gold medal athlete, quote unquote, board members could do a better job representing those other athletes, those ineligible to hold board seats themselves. Van or Michael, do you have thoughts on this?
Dan, why don't you go first?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think I'll situate it in examples. So I think one of the ways that we did this well in the past, and something that I hope continues in the future, is our quote unquote gold medal athletes and our grassroots level and younger athletes, they did a really good job, I think, of developing a relationship between each other, and that relationship led to really good communication. And I think that ongoing communication and ongoing dialogue, and appreciation for what the 10 to 18-year-old experiences at their run-of-the-mill weekend swimming competition is like. And it, on the other hand, what are the issues and what are the challenges that a world championship or Olympic medal holder faces, at professional competitions. And that dialogue, I think, really is what helps and gives me confidence that even though there are only obstacle level athletes on our board, the dialogue is still there, and the appreciation for each other's backgrounds and needs is what comes through. But so to answer Carolyn's question, it really boils down to, are they seeking out diverse perspectives and developing relationships with those people to better understand what their needs and goals are.
Great. And I see that Thomas had a question beforehand. Thomas, do you still want to jump in?
Yes, may I?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Michael, you talk about a lot of transparency issue, the difference between the quote unquote gold medal athletes and the vast majority of athletes. The separation is bad, and we could see that difference in table tennis. And one of the things that we might have a chance, or we may have a chance, is to satisfy this 33% athletes rule in adding 2 athletes and maybe 1 more board seat that could represent the juniors, which is the vast majorities. So I don't know, what do you think about that particular structure? Not necessarily having an under 18 juniors to serve on the board for legal purposes, but having some kind of representation for, I mean, we have like probably 30% of the members are juniors, and they don't have any vote, they don't have any say, nobody's representing them because they haven't been played in the Olympics at all. Maybe you could help.
Yeah, I mean, I that is the crux of the problem. The issues that the elite athletes think are the most important issues are not the issues that the development athletes are. So whether that extra 13% of seats can go to someone representing them or not, I think is up for debate. Some people think that'll work. Some don't necessarily think that that's what it's intended to be. So I think we have to wait and see what if that's possible. But it's obviously an issue, and some people are a little more concerned about it than others.
Would something like a committee of the juniors who recommend someone that represent them, not necessarily as a part of the athletes themselves? So
I think that's a possible solution to it. That's a possible way to deal with it. And hopefully that person is true to that.
It could be like a parents of the athletes.
Well, if it's in that 33%, then I think it has to have some sort of.
No, it's outside. It's outside the 33.
Okay. Well, then hopefully, I mean, realistically, all of your board should be interested in the development of athletes,
Right.
because that is in most cases that is the rank and file of the organization and the membership. But that isn't always what plays out.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Sorry, I'm just a little distracted. Tony's trying to get in, so.
Yes, I see that he has just joined. Welcome, Tony.
Oh, okay.
So
Good.
just to also, I know that I introduced him a bit at the beginning of this meeting, but just to give an additional background to Tony, he's a former U.S. men's national team player with U.S. Soccer, had a long professional career with the organization. And since then, in 2003, he established the Sane Foundation to support community-based organizations and to assemble a supportive network within the community that provides positive environments for urban youth to become positive and productive adults. So welcome, Tony. I am the executive director of the boarding school moderating this conversation. We also have representation from Next Gen United, which was the campaign that we supported to get 5 young athletes onto US Soccer's Athlete Council on an equity and inclusion platform. And we have representation from USA Table Tennis, I believe USA Archery here, as well as USA Speed Skating. So a number of different organizations giving context to the ways that they include young athletes in their governance structures. Michael and Van are our panelists here from USA Swimming, and I know Michael was the person who invited you. So thank you for joining us, and happy to let you give your own introduction and what you hope to add to this conversation as well right now.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and Michael, thanks for including me. I had soccer when I grew up. I was one of a few kids of color, and then as a professional and playing with U.S. Soccer in the system, our country is very, very divided in the fact that the professional soccer players think that they run everything and it revolves around them, and then you have the women, and then who want equity, which there's no doubt that there should be equity. And then you have the youth, and then you have special needs, and you have beach. So, I've experienced all of that. And at the core of my work now is youth development and really focusing on equity and access, and really about the fundamentals that we all have to invest in the pyramid and the base of the pyramid. And it's kind of like focusing on the social determinants of health. What's really driving this? Only 20% of health outcomes are clinically driven. And so if we look at where our biggest base are, we can never forget about them, because if we do, sports will go away, period. So, we can't rely on the 10 kids that are playing to be these elite athletes. And I think, in overhearing some of this stuff, and I'm happy to make it more conversational, but there does have to be a place and a platform for different voices. And it's sometimes, even running a board, we have an advisory board to allow more people to talk. And eventually, if their voices are never heard, they'll just go away. So although some people may not have a fiduciary responsibility or real vote, making sure that they have time to really say how they're feeling and how they feel about it. Because at the end of the day, I don't think people want to hurt each other or realize it. Some people are self-absorbed on what's best for me or my group. But when you really think about what those decisions are doing to others, sometimes it lets you change the frame of your thinking.
Great. So I just added a request in the chat for questions to start off, but I wonder if Michael or Van, if you have, knowing Tony, having worked with Tony in the past, have thoughts on what the governance structures between USA Swimming and USA Soccer differ or are similar in, that could be beneficial to the inclusion of younger athletes in their respective governance structures, or have been sort of detrimental in their differences. If you have questions for Tony on this, I mean.
Michael?
I think one of the biggest differences between soccer and swimming is swimming, the racial issues are very different. Swimming doesn't really have a whole lot of minorities in the sport. So making efforts to get diverse populations into the sport really starts at learn to swim programs. And, it's not so much in keeping racially diverse people in the sport necessarily as much as it is trying to overcome the numerous racial issues surrounding just access to swimming pools, particularly in urban areas. Those, when a rec department has budget issues, swimming pool is the first thing that gets closed in an urban rec department, generally speaking.
I guess, and I agree with what Michael's saying, and not to pivot a little bit, but I guess my question for Tony and or the group would be, I think that like we talk and we encourage our younger leaders in USA Swimming, about athlete voice. We talk about athlete voice as something that, it's powerful. But in a lot of circumstances, the voice isn't enough and the vote's important. So I guess how, and in swimming, I mean, the way that the structure is set up now is that our elite level athletes are the ones with the vote at the board level, and our grassroots level athletes, they have voice. So I guess two-pronged. Is it the voice and vote that's important, or can we do enough just with our voice?
Well, I personally think that the voice is the most important, unless you're being ignored. So I guess the responsibility is, when people are voicing and coming there, are they listening? I mean, if nobody's listening, eventually they'll go away, and they'll say, like, they'll realize it's lip service. So if the voting members actually listen, and it's, I don't want to bring up something political, but you look at the electoral college in this country. If if everyone voted one way and the electoral college decided to do something different just because they could, is that right? And at some point then, and they need to be held accountable. So I think the voice is the most important. If in a perfect world that we're listening. Unfortunately, people will still make decisions on their own self-interest. So that's where, I guess, needing votes, or you put in some satisfactory surveys where voting members keep their sheets based on the satisfactory of the members on, do they feel like they voted in their best interest? Are they aligning with the members, or are they just making decisions based on their own will? So there has to be some kind of accountability for the people that have the votes, or you have to give more people votes, in my opinion.
I think that's spot on.
Great. And I see that Rebecca had a hand raised. Rebecca, if you want to jump in, I'll spotlight you and feel free to ask.
Hi, so I'm actually an athlete director for USA Gymnastics, and I think a lot of these conversations we've had today stirred up a lot of thoughts for myself included and for the organization. I find that, especially in gymnastics, the peak age is a lot younger than a lot of other sports. So there's almost this gap of, there's 12-year-olds that are on national team, and, they're definitely still too young to sit on these positions or even feel like they have a voice. So it's kind of, how do you find that leeway or promote athlete voice for athletes that are so young and don't really understand the responsibility that they hold? Because in my personal experience at 12 years old, I was getting sent internationally and didn't really understand the importance of my voice or how much I was contributing to the organization. So for us, at least the grassroots level, is usually adults or coaches or people within the organization that are the voice of that. But I guess what kind of ideas you would have for athletes that are so young to still feel involved, but and like vice versa?
Well, my personal, I think maybe in gymnastics it's different. Whether you peak at an early age, is there a voice for high school gymnasts that are never going to go on anywhere on those standards? If we face it, high level athletes are different, right? They basically give up half their life to focus on that, whether you play soccer, swimming, or gymnastics. I mean, really, realistically, you don't have balance in your life, right? No world-class gymnast has balance. No world-class swimmer has balance, right? They're spending that much time doing that. So, but are we keeping the sport going by making sure that there's equity involved, that everybody likes the sport, that we're building the base? So in some sense, I guess it's not necessarily always who's the best in the world, like who are the professional athletes, but who are the people participating. And I would think that even at an amateur level, people that decide to go on in the future, just to keep doing it, is healthy for all sports, because it provides inclusion. and it makes it an art. And otherwise, we might as well pay everybody, and then at the end of the day, like which sports are getting paid the most. But a lot of these, we would call them amateur sports that are 501c3s. Even the U.S. national soccer team are a business. So we have to look at things differently. I think we really have to look at how people feel. How do we make people feel? If I'm in high school and I'm a gymnast and I'm going to do great in my state, but I'm not good enough to go to college, do I feel like nobody in the world of gymnastics cares about me? And if that's the case, then I think the sport is doing a disservice, because people are going to start quitting. And then it's going to be harder and harder to gain talent, because the base of that pyramid is going to get smaller and more elitist.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think I'm sure as far as like the other organizations, the USOPC has pushed for mostly like independent directors. So there's kind of this gap of USA Gymnastics members, and the only people who can sit on the board are a lot of them are the athlete reps, which by this 10-year rule. So which doesn't include the grassroots. So essentially, at least for the gymnastics, there's only potentially one seat available for a person within the grassroots program to even have a voice on the board. So I agree, the local committees are important, and how to like scale it down with such a large organization to then bring it down to people. Those are some great points. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I see Nathan also dropped a question in the chat saying, I would love for Van to elaborate on how the local committees incorporate young athletes into their boards. That might serve as a good model for how other sports bodies might give a voice to younger athletes that don't fit the USOPC requirements. Van, do you want to fill in context there?
Yeah, sure. So our local swimming committees are required by the USA Swimming bylaw template to have 20% athlete representation on their boards. And then our National Athletes Executive Committee does a lot of focused education and training in governance and in leadership development for those athletes, so that they can learn how to use the athlete voice, but also what their governance responsibilities are, because they also have a vote. So our push in swimming has been, over the last probably about 6 or 7 years, has really been to work on leadership development amongst the athlete ranks, if you will, to try and kind of dovetailing off what Tony said, make people feel like they're getting something in the way of an extrinsic benefit other than just their times, which is in swimming, besides their performance. But how are we working to enrich their lives as young people? I will say, being an athlete representative it is certainly the most formative experience to date in my life. It completely dictated my course of study in undergraduate school, and it also is what inspired me to go to law school, so that I could be, as Michael joked before, I'm also one of the people who totally nerds out on bylaws and policies and topics like governance, like Michael does, and I wanted to go to law school and learn more about that. But that was because of my experience as an athlete representative and as an athlete leader. And so by starting with leadership as the fundamental premise and foundation, that has really, I think, helped our athletes that are younger and are on our local swimming committee board really find their voice and find their vote.
And I think USA Swimming at Van and my daughter Kelly, when she was on the athlete executive committee, they pushed USA Swimming to spend a lot of money on some of those leadership development things. And fortunately, they had a receptive board and some key people on the board who believed in it. They bought into it, and they authorized the spending of thousands of dollars to organize various leadership camps around the country, where they brought swimmers from all 59 LSCs together for long weekends of both swimming and leadership training as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna, I'm a little frustrated that we don't spend more money on that now. I mean, in 2017, we spent $350,000 on athlete leadership amongst our grassroots level athletes, you know. Now we spend about 30,000. So my cynical side is I wish we spent more of our financial resources in doing this more at the national level. But I'm proud to say that, you know, because of what we did at the national level in the past and the dribbles that continue today, you know, our local swimming committees are now independently investing in that for grassroots level athletes.
As much as I'd like to hear Van talk about how much he wants to grow up to be like me, we should probably focus more on Tony, because I know he's got somewhere he's got to go in about 10 minutes or so. So let's swing back to Tony.
Yeah, I think I have time for one question, but I think, you know, Van, you know, you hit it right on. You know, it is difficult because there's not enough money to go around, so we think. And so, you know, part of the problem, it's like taxes. Are taxes too high, or is what we're spending it on? And so we also can think about ways in being more creative to leverage our sponsors, to ask them to make, you know, investments, not only in the Olympic teams that they're going to get, you know, high return on for eyeballs, but also in the communities to support the development of the sport. So that, you know, if I think you can leverage the strength of your brand and your total membership, and look at other ways to raise money, because at the end of the day, if there's no money, there's no money. And everybody's always fighting over the money. So I think another thing is how do we raise more money, and how do we get more directed to us from the business piece to the philanthropic piece or the equity piece.
Great. And I see Thomas has a question. Maybe that can be the one last one for Tony before you have to leave. Thomas, I will spotlight you and feel free to jump in.
Thank you. I think money is really not an issue. There is, like Tony said, there is a lot of way to fundraise, and there actually is a lot of people who are willing to volunteer. I think it's really the corporate structure or the organization structure that, if that allows the base to grow, money, I mean, my experience, even in table tennis, a small sport is in the United States, money is definitely not an issue. It's really the leadership. And this is why I want your guys' feedback on how we could change the leadership so that it allows these growing the base, like Tony said, give these people the voice. Otherwise, like you said, I noticed firsthand too, people actually left because their voice didn't get heard.
Thank you, Thomas, and everybody. And like I said, I agree. But I think you are, like you said, you know, this is a good step from what I'm hearing. Is you guys you're talking about it. Everyone's talking about it. And I think, you know, having dialogue, bringing people together, and just being more intentional about making sure people's voices are heard. And you have people like Thomas on here that, you know, some of us don't see that or don't notice that, right? Are we starting to notice why there's not participation? Are people leaving? You know, are they leaving because their voices aren't being heard, which is very important. So I appreciate you having me, and congratulations on the steps that you're making. We're all in this together, different sports, different athletes, that we want to create a more inclusive environment in this world. And we also know the positive effect that all sport has on community. And my thing is that every sport is a beautiful game. And the more you learn about any sport, you know, the more fabulous it gets. It's challenging in this country because we've marketed certain sports, so they're popular. We've marketed male sports, so they're popular. So we need to be intentional and, for lack of a better word, overinvest in other athletes, other sports, to create opportunities for other people.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, Tony. We really appreciate your time. And I know that other folks might need to jump off in a second as well. So what I'll do is I'll ask Michael, Van, Tony offline if you all might be willing to share your contact information confidentially with the folks who attended today. You all don't have to answer now, but if people, before they hop off, want to drop their email or whatever other contact information they want to share in the chat, in case folks want to reach out to other audience members or panelists that came out here, feel free to drop your own contact information in the chat, and I can, share it out in a follow-up email to all those who attended today. But, for those who can stay and want to continue the conversation, I know that Michael and Van blocked off a little bit more time to be here with you all. So I will, I'm here to moderate more questions. I know that one thing that we didn't speak about much is what the effect of the recent changes to the Ted Stevens Act might have on the role of the athlete director in a lot of these organizations. We touched on it a little bit, but that might be one of the things that Van wants to elaborate on, given that a lot of sports organizations are dealing with that right now. If there are additional developments in the world of athlete activism that Van or Michael want to highlight, I'm sure that's also something that could be of interest to our audience members here today.
I'm planning on being here till 4. Tony, thank you again. Go raise $1 million or whatever you're raising tonight.
Working
Or
on
more.
it.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, Tony's got his foundation's gala fundraiser online this year, tonight. So it was a challenge for him to cut out a few minutes for us. So I'm glad he was able to do that. Hopefully you all found it beneficial, and he's a great guy, and he's really sets a great example of a post-athlete career as well. When your playing days are over, what you can do to stay involved and to help your community. He also went to the same high school that my kids went to, so he showed up there frequently as well, giving frequent inspirational talks and that sort of thing. Great community guy. And he was a great player.
Great. Any last questions from our audience members, or notes that, best practices or lessons learned that you all want to share, Van and Michael, with this group that's here with us today?
I'd like to actually, we were talking about sort of the disparity between the elite athletes and the rank and file athletes. And I'd like to cite an example from my own son's experience. When I said he was on the USA Swimming Age Group Development Committee, they, a few years back, entertained a restriction. For those who don't know much about swimming, swimming for the most part is low on the cost when it comes to equipment, but there is one problem in the world of swimming is the cost of competition suits. Swimmers will practice in one set of swimsuits, but they will compete in a totally different kind of a swimsuit, which is very expensive, upwards of $500 for a swimsuit that you'll only really wear 8, maybe 10 times before it's really not that effective anymore. They provide tremendous amount of compression, sometimes a little bit of extra buoyancy, and they're referred to as tech suits. I see speed skating as well in the chat. So there was the different LSCs around the country were undertaking steps to restrict the use of these competition suits, mostly for 12 and unders. Some I think were 10 and unders. One LSC was considering 14 and unders. And then basically the cry went out, we need a global rule. We need a rule for the whole country because we can't have 59 different LSCs with 59 different sets of restrictions. So USA Swimming took it up, and it landed in the lap of the Age Group Development Committee. At the time, my son, who was 18 at the time, was serving as one of the athlete reps on it. And the restriction to basically what ended up passing was a restriction on 12 and unders wearing these tech suits in competitions. And you're not going to get an elite athlete who's sponsored by Speedo or Tier or Arena to get out in front of this. They're not going to say, yes, we should ban these things because this is their sponsor. They're not going to do that. So that's a pretty significant example where the interests are not aligned. Similarly, some teams are sponsored by these swimsuit providers as well. So the coaches who run these teams don't have an incentive to limit the use of these swimsuits. They want all of their swimmers out there spending $500 on a Speedo tech suit because the team is sponsored by Speedo, and it requires that relationship in order for the team to get that sponsorship. So even in the case where the athlete is not necessarily aligned with the coach, I mean, that's a case of that as well. And there are other spots as well. So that's one obvious example that I witnessed myself in my time with USA Swimming. There are a number of other things that, again, the elite athletes, their problems ain't your problems, and your problems ain't their problems. So somebody's got to be there at that level, representing the rank and files issues at some level.
Great. And I see Nathan has another question. Nathan, jump in.
Yeah, I think like the big headline from the latest reauthorizing or whatever of the Ted Stevens Act is the jump from 20% to 33%. But one, are there other important things that have changed? And two, how much leeway do federations actually have in how they apply the Ted Stevens Act within their governance, or is it like really strict with exactly what you have to do?
It used to be pretty loose, but part of the developments that came out of the Nassar situation was that the USOPC does require all NGBs now to file an annual compliance audit, which includes, I think, 4 different categories with multiple questions in each category. So for the first time 2 or 3 years ago, someone was actually looking at these things. Previously, it was just you're on your own, please comply, but there's no real teeth to it. There's no real looking back at it. So that's, with nobody looking over the shoulder, nobody's, got an incentive to do the right thing. So you end up with problems. So now that Congress is breathing down the USOPC's back, the USOPC is now breathing down the NGB's back. And that's where we are today. Yeah, the 20 to 33% is great, but it still isn't 50. It still isn't 50 plus 1. So athletes are still minority voice at this point, a little closer to equal, but still a minority. Let's see. One of the other things that came out of the Empowering Athletes Act, one of the questions, again, with the Nassar situation was the US, at the time, USOC, they didn't have P as part of their name yet, was told that they need to de-recognize, or whatever the term is, the USA Gymnastics, and decertify. And USOC said, can we do that? We don't know. Because there's nothing in the original Ted Stevens or the amended Ted Stevens that said the US Olympic Committee could decertify an NGB. It said they could certify them, but it didn't say they had the authority to strip that. So this act, this new Empowering Athletes Act, does say that NGBs can be decertified. So that's one positive step. It eliminates that question. It doesn't answer the question of who can decertify them necessarily. Can the USOPC decertify them, or does it have to be Congress that decertifies them? So I think that's still an open question. Van, you might have different interpretation of that, but that's kind of what I've been reading.
No, that's generally my understanding as well. And yeah, I agree with everything that Michael said. In swimming's perspective, we just didn't comply until someone started telling us we needed to. So that's the one thing I would add. But, I think an interesting follow-up conversation would be, I think there's a lot of information to chew on that's been shared here, but, an interesting follow-up would be, to talk about both the changes that happened through the Sports Act, but also the changes that happened to the USOPC bylaws, and how that's going to evolve or not evolve athlete and young athlete representation at the NGB level. So just kind of earmark that, because I think it's up for debate, and I think it's an unsettled conversation, and I think it's gonna evolve. But one of the things, just this is purely my opinion here, is like, you really got to look hard at why the USOPC is the one who says that the only eligible athletes are your quote unquote gold medal level athletes. I wonder about that. I think back to what Tony said, we really gotta remember that we have to invest in the bottom of the pyramid in order to make sure that there's a path to grow the top of the pyramid.
That's a great sort of tidbit there, Van. I think Thomas had his hand raised a minute ago. Thomas, do you still have a question?
Yeah, a point I want to share something too, and both Michael and Van was talking about exactly the same thing, right? And we all want to have athletes that have a lot of representation. The way USOPC now is just saying blanket 33% is still pretty much the gold medalist, the elite athlete. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that population is much smaller than the rank and file, like Michael said. Now, I also noticed there's a Borders Commission report that USOPC published, and also after that gymnastic issue, right? And they classify or break down the athlete into 3 classes: the retired athlete, the competing athlete, which is what the current gold medalist athletes, and then there's another section called pipeline or emerging athletes, which is, I think most of us thinking is the grassroots, the kids that are going to be competing in the Olympics. But I don't know if you Michael, if you heard anything that USOPC will adjust that piece, the pipeline athletes.
I read the Borders report when it first came out. I also read several other things about the same time. So they're all kind of a jumble. I'm not sure which one was which at this point, because it was over a year and a half ago, I think. I don't have a lot of positive sense the USOPC is going to make the right choices unless they're forced into it. They don't look at the sport the way athletes do. They look at it as as a money-making venture, and unless they're forced into it by some outside force, they're going to be slow. They're going to react slowly. They're not going to be out in front, put it that way, of making the right decision, in my opinion.
But you think about the whole Test Stevens Act, right? The whole vulnerability is really with the younger kids. The whole safe sport. It's not so much with the older athlete. They're 18 or over. I think they could pretty much protect themselves. I believe the younger athletes are not being adjusted. It's going to hit USOPC or hit whoever the NGB really, really hard.
Well, I mean, we've seen it in certainly in gymnastics. Taekwondo, I know, has had some problems. Other sports as well. And, there are some 18 and up athletes that have raised some concerns as well. But yeah, the vulnerable certainly are the younger. They're more vulnerable. This does put more responsibility on the USOPC to not duck responsibility, which they have for years. They have said, we don't have any athletes. It's the NGBs that have the athletes. That's not our job. So these recent changes have made it more difficult for the USOPC to get out from under those responsibilities. Included, in fact, in the act is the USOPC needs to require $20 million to fund the Center for Safe Sport. So that's significant, and we'll see what happens with that.
Great. Well, thank you, Thomas. And because we're at almost an hour and a half now of our conversation, I'm just going to allow people to have one last chance to ask a question to our panelists or to other audience members here, just as we have everyone in the room. And I see Carolyn has also dropped an observation in the chat that might spark some ideas for people.
Yeah, I just noticed that Michael had said that we're expecting the USOPC to step up at all times to make a decision. I think that that's a sentiment that a lot of people have felt sometimes, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I think that we can also try to, improve the way we work with them and try to, help them decide the way that we would.
I think the reason that the USOPC ends up being kind of the target is, and Van as a litigator will tell you, when you're suing, when you're filing a lawsuit, you go after the deep pockets, and that's where the money is. And the U.S. Olympic Committee, USOPC, has tons of money in the bank. Although if the Olympics don't happen this summer, they might not have quite as much. And a lot of the NGBs just don't have the money. So you could sue an NGB for negligence and win, and then the NGB is out of business and you never got any money. So I think that's how the USOPC gets pulled into this discussion when there is an abuse case or there is a lawsuit or something like that. So that's kind of where they get pulled in, and then they successfully ducked that for years by saying we're not responsible for athletes. The NGBs are. So it is kind of a adversarial relationship to some extent, but you're right. It should be more collaborative. It should be more cooperative. And it hasn't been. It'd be great if it was.
Great. Okay. So with that, if I'm going to check the chat to make sure no one has any other questions. I see we even have people that have joined within the last few minutes. So if those people that have jumped in, if you want to introduce yourselves briefly in the chat with where you're coming from, what organization you're affiliated with. We've been talking for a long time about starting with USA Swimming's 2018 governance restructure, how different models of inclusive governance have featured into different sports organizations. And we have representation from a number of them on this call right now, but great. Without further ado, if people need to head out, I wanted to say thanks so much for coming out to this conversation. I'll be sharing a recording of it, as well as the contact information of those that have shared it in the chat with all those who have attended here, in case people want to follow up afterwards. I'll also be sharing a feedback form in the Facebook and LinkedIn event pages that we had set up for the event, in case people have additional ideas on what we could have done better or what you really enjoyed about this conversation, as well as if there are additional topics in the realm of inclusive governance, particularly of young people in sports organizations, that you would like to hear other folks speak on, or that you would like the boarding school to put on educational programming about. We would love to hear from you, and the feedback form is a great place to share that insight. I also added sort of a number of other ways to get involved with the boarding school and the work that we're doing to educate, place, and support young people on boards of directors of organizations that are important to them. And feel free to get involved with any of those options as well. Great. And I see that other people are sharing their contact information in the chat. For anyone else. Oh, go ahead, Van.
Oh, yes, I just wanted to thank everybody, for the opportunity. And like I said, I think it would be really encouraging to do a follow-up on this and see if we can get, some others involved in the dialogue between then and now. And it's fascinating to me how it's evolving. And I really appreciated the questions and the participation from the members of the audience today too. So thank you, Julia and the boarding school, for putting this together. And
I'll echo what Van said, and I'll thank you for including this old man in it, as undoubtedly the oldest person included.
Thank you both for, going out on a limb and speaking to a lot of these young people who are involved in their sports organizations about something that happened a couple years back with USA Swimming, and something that can get easily very detail oriented. I appreciate both of your times, and everyone else for coming out today and participating.
Julia, will you provide notes of the call? This is Tara Prophet. I was in the process of buying a car, and I just got on the call, and I see that it's going to be ending. Will you be providing any kind of recording or anything of the call?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll share a recording of the call, and then we'll also be sharing a blog post that summarizes sort of the meat of our conversation on the boarding school's blog that I can share as well.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry I got in so late. I fully intended on joining, but I got held up at the dealership. So I apologize.
No worries. Thanks for coming. Do you want to share what organization you're with and where you're calling in from?
USA Table Tennis. I'm calling in from Apollo Beach, Florida. And I am on the USA Table Tennis board, and I am the chair of the Athletes Advisory Council for USA Table Tennis. And I'm a member of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, AAC.
Amazing. A lot of different sort of governance role representation from the athlete side. Great to have you.
Thank you.
I took the effort to put together a bit of a reading list as well with some links, which I'll send to Julia, and you can send it out. And if people want to read it, they can read it. It won't hurt my feelings. The first thing on the list, I think everybody should read. I mean, I think you should read them all, but especially the first thing on the list. It's from the outgoing head of the USOPC Athlete Advisory Committee, Han Chio, talking about some of the fundamental weaknesses in athlete advisory committees and suggestions for making them better. It actually starts out as a bit of a downer, but it does pick up in terms of becomes more positive towards the end. But I do think anybody who serves as an athlete on an athlete advisory committee should read that as soon as they know they're on the committee. And it really will save you some time in terms of learning about what you're going to experience, and some of the limitations of your role in that committee, but still go in knowing that that's part of it. So that'll be first on the list, and then I've got some other stuff that we may or may not have touched on also on the list. And if you've got time, feel free to read it. And again, I won't feel personally hurt if you don't, but it's there for you if you want it. So I'll send that to Julia, and then you can set it out.
Absolutely. I'll be sure to include that in my follow-up email, and really appreciate you putting together that list. I'm sure that that's something that would be helpful for a lot of young people trying to get into these roles and serving in these roles now.